Hello and welcome to Latika Takes, a podcast with me, Latika Berg. Hello, welcome back to the podcast. This week's episode is coming to you from a very snowy, icy, frankly perilous Washington, D.C. And my guest today is an absolute treat. And I think you can always tell when I have a great interview because it will go longer than 30 minutes, which is no insult to anyone who I've kept to time. I'm trying to be quite polite, I guess. But my next guest is someone who lets me push the friendship, so to speak. Jim Townsend is an absolute ace in terms of defence, transatlantic alliance, geopolitics, everything, the whole gamut. And I'm so excited to have this interview. And you will not be disappointed because you will hear his expertise is just second to none. I mean, Jim Townsend has been working on US security on NATO, variously in the Pentagon, in NATO, and at the Atlantic Council think tank for more than 2 decades. He was, in fact, as you'll hear in this interview, the guy that dismantled US bases after the collapse of the Soviet Union or the end of the Cold War in Greenland. And so we spend a lot of our discussion focusing on what Trump said about Greenland. Now, I do want to say one thing. It is crazy, insane how the news cycle just moves on. And it's only it is literally only a couple of weeks since Donald Trump was threatening to invade a NATO ally. Can we all just register this? And we've all seemed to have moved on because it was a Trumpian threat. It's dissipated. I actually don't take this view. And I really worry that one of the things we're doing with Trump is we're numbing or desensitizing ourselves, or to use a term from nuclear policy, we're dosing ourselves. And we're becoming more and more conditioned to accept crazy, insane, but most seriously damaging things that are being said and done by this Trump administration without any sort of coherent strategy behind it. Where there is coherent strategy, as you'll hear in this interview, I'm actually very open to a lot of things Trump is saying and doing if it leads to better security architecture for us all in the long run, and I think some of it may. But I do think the threatened invasion of Greenland and the subsequent trashing of Allied war dead in Afghanistan were two things that we shouldn't forget, and I actually don't think people will forget. And in that, I think it's not just the policy community, it's not just government, it's not just journalists, although we're probably the first to forget, we just move on so quickly. But I actually think this does reach the public, and I think we've got to be very conscious of that underlying trend that's happening. I think a lot of people in our publics in Australia, obviously, where I spend a lot of time focusing on, but in the UK too, where I live, I think people were really angry by that. And there's a lot of latent anger now that wasn't necessarily there with Trump before. So I think this is presenting a huge challenge to our leaders. And obviously it's very unfair. They shouldn't have to deal with this, but we are where we are. So I really wanted to go through a lot of these things with Jim, and I'm really happy to say he was the man for this conversation. We met in DC and I said, look, come on, it will be half an hour and we'll go have a cup of coffee after. We ended up talking for an hour and every single minute was fantastic and interesting, and I could have gone on for another hour. And in the end, I repaid him not with a coffee but with a couple of red wines, actually sangria for him. Sorry, Jim, just doubted you. I really hope you enjoyed this conversation. I absolutely loved it. I think there is so much to think about. I think Jim said some really new things about the future of Europe, about the NATO alliance, also about where America lands and also where allies land after all this is said and done. So without further ado, let's get to it. Jim Townsend, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here. Thank you for asking me along.
As someone who dedicated decades of their life to US national security, do you feel like your work is being undone?
I think my work is under pressure, and it's not just my work, but so many others in the Foreign Service and the Civil Service and the military from allied countries. Ever since the end of the Cold War, we have been working very hard to refashion the U.S.-European transatlantic relationship, the defense system that we have through NATO. We've been trying to make it fit for the 21st century, and I think we are finding what had a lot of potential, great potential, to build a Europe and a U.S. that can be away from the Cold War days, away from stress, to be stable, to be prosperous. We're finding that has run into roadblocks in some surprising places, particularly a roadblock coming from the White House.
You've been in NATO how many years? 2 decades, was it?
I've been working with NATO really since probably the mid-90s, and I worked there in person from 1998 to 2002.
So you will know better than most that the reason NATO was formed is now maybe not as compatible with the threat picture the world faces, particularly the one that the United States faces in the form of the Chinese Communist Party. Isn't it the case that actually Trump's complaints about NATO, some of those are very legitimate, and trying to refashion NATO so that Europeans take more responsibility is actually a very sensible outcome out of all of this?
Well, that's a very good point. And what I would say is that it's been a bipartisan issue in the United States, and it's been a longstanding issue about burden sharing with the Europeans, not just in terms of how much of their GDP they put towards defense, but also their willingness to go on NATO missions and to do other things like that. The feeling has been that there's got to be a rebalancing, and we're starting to see this thanks to Putin and the aggression that we've seen since 2014. Trump has also added a push over the past year particularly, and so you have to give him some credit as well. But your point's well taken in the sense that when NATO was first established, it was the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact that we had to deal with. And so the U.S. led the effort, and the Europeans were very happy for that. And so the effort, particularly between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, was such that the U.S. had to provide the lion's share of the equipment and the manpower and the nuclear aspect to it. That was something that only the U.S. could really bring. And the Allies also brought capabilities along as well. After the Cold War ended in 1990-91, there was very quickly a peace dividend that both the U.S. and the Allies sought as well. And so forces were cut, spending was cut. And we went along pretty well for a decade or so, trying to fashion a defense establishment both at NATO and nationally as well that made sense when there wasn't a Soviet Union and a Warsaw Pact. But the rise of China came about during the Obama administration. I think that was when a lot of the West woke up to that, including the United States. And we realized that we needed to do much more in the Asia-Pacific area. We needed to build our alliances there. We needed to build our military capability there. We needed to figure out where China was going with this. Of course, by that time, the Russians had invaded Crimea, so we found ourselves with a threat on the Russia side in Europe and a threat in the Asia-Pacific side as well. And we understood as time went on that we would not be able to face both fronts like that. So the Europeans needed to do more in Europe so we could handle the Asia-Pacific. But NATO was a bit slow to wake up to that, and so were the European allies. They woke up to it in 2022 when the Russians went deeper into Ukraine.
So we met in The Hague at
That's
the
right.
NATO summit last year, considered widely as a success.
Yes.
And the feeling was very jubilant, I might say, after that. NATO, Mark Rutte, who leads NATO, formed a very good relationship with Donald Trump. Many say it's fawning, but it certainly yielded results.
Right.
Do you think that the NATO that was shored up at The Hague itself is now in jeopardy by what Trump has done in threatening Greenland?
Well, I mean, that's a great question, and it's what all the allies are struggling with. At the Hague summit, the good news was that allies agreed to the 5% of GDP going towards both procurement as well as infrastructure investments. So that was
Do you
great.
believe in the legitimacy of that? I sense around a lot of capitals, the 5% is a bit of a made-up figure and no one's really intending to get there. And certainly no one's really shown how they intend to get there. Very few other than the Baltics.
Well, that's a great question. And what I would say is that if the closer you live to Russia, the more you're going to do it. So Poland, I think, has already reached the 5%. I think the Nordic countries will, the Balts will. Germany is doing a massive rearmaments campaign right now. France is. UK is struggling with this idea of what we call guns or butter because they've got a lot of domestic ills that money's got to be placed towards and their economy is not doing so well. But the further south in Europe, Europe you go, the threat assessment as far as Russia is concerned, it doesn't really impact in Athens, say, as much as it does in Riga or in Stockholm. But if you've got the Russians on your doorstep, like the Poles do, or Romania, you're going to hit it more quickly because you realize that if the United States begins to disengage or limit its engagement, if it begins to reduce its force posture in Europe, that it's going to come down to your ability to deter or fend off the Russians. And so a problem that nations are running into right now in terms of rearming themselves is just the delivery schedules for the equipment they know that they need to buy. So there's a clock ticking right now. A lot of the intelligence agencies are saying the Russians could be on the march in the next 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. You hear different years. But that's not a lot of time when it's hard for you to get the equipment that you've purchased because defense industry, both in the U.S. and in Europe, have lost the ability to surge production. So even though you might have the money, you're not going to get delivery of, say, HIMARS, long-range strike artillery. You're not going to get delivery of those systems for maybe 10 years, and you need it 5 years from now. You need it right now. So there is a rush right now with the northern European countries to not only make sure they've got the money, but going to places where they know that they can buy and get deliveries quicker than probably from the United States. An example is Poland. They are going to South Korea to buy a lot of their equipment because they can get deliveries soon. But again, you go into Southern Europe and it's a bit different. They're not quite on board this idea of rearming themselves as quickly as, say, the Poles would be.
And what do you make of that attitude?
Well, I think it goes back to your question about NATO unity. And after the Hague summit, the fact that the 5% was agreed and war plans had been agreed to as well, plus the defense planning aspect of the war plans, which is NATO going to each nation and saying, this is what you need to bring to the party. You need to have this many squadrons, this many tanks, et cetera. So the Hague summit put the alliance in a good place in terms of plans, in terms of knowing what everyone needed to do. But your point's well taken in the sense that as allies shirk that a bit, and not all allies are, as I said, but those allies that are shirking that, they're hurting the unity of the alliance because at The Hague, there was certainly the symbolism that the alliance was unified on this. They were actually putting money on the table. They were ready to go. If they go back to their capitals and then they say to their parliament or to the media, we'll do it as we can, then you're undercutting that unity coming out of that summit. And that's what Putin is looking at. How divided is the alliance? Can they be undercut? Putin's saying, if I can get the United States to walk away and that weakens the alliance, that makes it easier on me to do something after Crimea is behind us. So that unity is everything. And that's what I'm worried about, not just in terms of allies doing what they need to do, but also in terms of what Trump is saying, because that undercuts unity as well.
It's interesting, though, because you're a bit more nuanced. It's not your view, I take it, solely that Trump is causing damage. It's actually up to a lot of these Western European capitals to shore up NATO for themselves.
Right. And I think what's happened now, I've been saying this, is we've kind of crossed the Rubicon here in terms of the alliance members saying to themselves, we can't really trust the United States like we did. We had a lot of confidence in the U.S. We had a lot of trust in the U.S. We felt that when Article 5 was invoked, the U.S. would be there. The U.S. has said that. The U.S. has forces in Europe to make sure that they're able to back that up. They've got a long history of exercising and making sure that we all could operate together, et cetera. Now, however, based on what Trump has said, not just in the past year, but also in his first term, the idea that he may be there, but he may not be there. Under certain circumstances, he will be there, but there could be circumstances when he would say, no, you guys do this, we're not going to get engaged. Or we're too busy dealing with China or Venezuela, whatever it might be. Our hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, is more important to us now, and you Europeans, you need to handle defense of Europe. Whatever it might be that lessens his engagement, that undermines trust, it undermines confidence, it undermines the unity of the alliance. So I think nations have now said, look, we've got to come up with a plan B, because if suddenly NATO is unable to take action for one reason or another, the U.S. hasn't joined consensus or on an Article 5 or something like that, what can we Europeans do together without the U.S., outside of NATO maybe? And so there's a lot of talk about that.
So do you believe that Article 5, if it was tested tomorrow, would stand?
I think Article 5, if tested tomorrow, would stand. I think for Trump, I think a lot depends on the scenario. I think for Trump, a lot depends on what it is that he's reacting to. Trump cares very much about his relationship with Putin and about his relationship with Russia. So I don't think he would be anxious to jump into something that would be a threat to Russia if he can say to the alliance, look, guys, let's not invoke Article 5. Let me call Putin on the phone and see if I can have him back off. I think you would see that kind of thing. And then at the end of the day, if nothing would stop Putin from whatever it was he was doing against an ally, I think the U.S. would get engaged, but it might be more limited. And that's what they have said, the administration, both in the National Defense Strategy as well as verbally, which is that the U.S. engagement and the U.S. provision of support to Europe would be limited. It would be, we would provide critical enablers in a sense, but that would be it. And so they're even looking at a deadline of 2027 as being the time when the Europeans had better be ready to take on the bulk of the combat mission if one comes to Europe.
And is it your assessment that Europe would be ready by 2027, or is that too soon?
Too soon. I think they're trying their best right now to organize themselves to be ready. I think everyone talks about it in terms of 10 years. That would be completely ready. But maybe in 5 years, they'd be pretty close to it. Because at the end of the day, it's about deterrence. What would deter the Russians? What would make Putin think the cost would be just too high to do something against one of the Balts, for instance, or Poland? Right now, if the U.S. was not engaged, the alliance doesn't have the critical mass, if you will, to last for too long in an intense fight. If there was a high-intensity combat that would take place against Russia, the European allies could maybe last a week or so in terms of just ammunition stocks. I mean, depending on the scenario, I hate to even speculate, but I do know that they're now trying to build themselves up so that they can stay in a fight, a high-intensity one if it comes to that. They can stay engaged for longer than a week. They know they have that problem. In 5 years, maybe they've got that solved. Maybe it'll be solved in 3 years. But again, like I said earlier, there's still this problem with delivery schedules of the critical equipment that they do need. So if Lockheed Martin says, I can't get you this for 5 years, then they're stuck. So there's some things that are going to have to wait for some time. There are other things I think that they can do now and do in the next couple of years that will help them in their deterrence. But they can't waste time. They have to be organized. And it's probably going to be a coalition of countries, really, that are going to do this kind of work to deter Russia. And that coalition is those nations that are around Russia and feel that they're in the crosshairs.
What's a critical enabler?
Critical enabler is something that enables or supports a combat mission. So, for instance, a tanker aircraft, an aircraft that provides fuels to an airplane they're flying, air-to-air refueling, that's a critical enabler because it enables that combat aircraft to remain in the air instead of having to go back to base for fuel. So that's an enabler. Intelligence is an enabler, not just on what the enemy is doing and where the enemy is, but helping the targeteers put in the target coordinates for artillery or for an aircraft strike or whatever. That kind of intelligence comes from satellites and this type of thing that the U.S. has the majority of. So that's an enabler. We enable the combat capabilities of the allies to do the combat mission. We enable them by providing the intelligence or providing the fuel or providing what we call combat service support or logistics, engineering, medical, things that support the warfighter who's out there on the line. So if we're not out there on the line, it's going to be the Europeans, and we will provide those things that keep them in the fight.
Do you think that's a fair balance?
No.
Why?
Because I think we've got to be on the line too. And, frankly, not a lot of people remember this or know this, but when NATO went into Libya, during the Obama days, we told the allies that we would provide the critical enablers for them, but they needed to fly the combat missions. And that was the first time we'd ever told the allies that. And I was one of the ones who had to tell the attachés here in town that, look, we're going to give you the air-to-air refueling and the intelligence, but you need to drop the bombs and do all that type of thing. And they were shocked because we'd always been part of it together. We weren't standing back and holding the coats for the guys who were in there doing the fighting. But that's what we did. And so we were signaling and telling the allies they needed to do more of the combat and not leave it on our shoulders. So this isn't just a Republican thing or a Trump thing. We did it during the Obama days as well. And so I personally feel that the U.S. has got to provide more than enablers in terms of having skin in the game, if you will, or being part of a combat effort. We have to have, there's some things that we're really good at in terms of combat. Well, there are a lot of things we're very good at combat, but allies are good at some certain things too. And I think we can't just limit ourselves to enablers. We've got to also be involved in the combat as well. And I think we'll have to see. If something were to happen in the years to come, we'll see what the U.S. contribution will be. I would hope that as enablers, I would hope it's more than that too, but I believe at the same time that by the time in a few years that we might see something happen, by that time I think the Europeans will have their own enablers. Because that's what we're talking about here. It's 5 years from now, 10 years from now. The Europeans should be stronger, and that means having their own enablers. That means having better intelligence from their own satellites. That means having larger combat units and maybe better armed combat units with the kinds of equipment that we have now and that they don't have, but they will have. So today, if we had to go in, we would, according to the administration, we'd be providing those enablers. But I think in the years to come, the Europeans will be able to do that kind of thing as well. They'll be better suited for combat.
If we got to that position in the years to come, that sounds to me like a very ideal and desirable outcome. And would that not justify the very ugly, but perhaps the very effective methods of Donald Trump here?
Well, that's a really important point. And it's hard to make this point because people are so upset with what Trump has done, what he has said, what he's doing in Minneapolis, what is the ugly things that he says about allies. It's the tactics. It's what he says. It's how he says it. It's how his administration talks to the allies. But at the end of the day, they're also raising issues that other administrations perhaps are a bit too diplomatic to raise, at least the way Trump is, and nothing was really done. Putin started the allies doing more because there's nothing like the wolf at your door to make you start doing things. But I think Trump came in and took off the gloves and said things that are just reprehensible. You would never say to an ally, he's saying it. And I guess the point is, you reach a point where that becomes self-defeating. Certainly that can, being blunt, gloves off, can propel people to move more quickly. But if you take it to the extreme that we have seen, bullying, the aggressiveness, threatening to take over Greenland, blackmailing, saying we're going to put a tariff on you if you do, I mean, that's taking it too far. Then it becomes counterproductive. It's blowing back. And the very allies you're trying to get to do more as they work with you in the future, all of a sudden they're not wanting to work with you anymore. No matter what they buy, no matter how strong they might get, they're starting to say, well, look, if you're going to act this way, screw you. I'm going to buy a lot of equipment, not so that I can make you happy or to work with you, but so that I don't need you. And pretty soon we start seeing that happen. And I think that's the kind of line that's been crossed.
So Greenland we'll get to in a second, but one of the most extreme examples, I think, from what you've been saying would be what Donald Trump said about Afghanistan, where he questioned, and it's not the first time he's done this, he's questioned over and over again whether allies would ever be there for America. Well, Article 5 has only ever been enacted once. It was after 9/11, and many NATO countries, including non-NATO countries, and I might say my native Australia here, contributed men who died on the field alongside Americans for this war, which you guys left in a disastrous and disgraceful fashion. Where is the pushback in the United States against Donald Trump for that? Because that to me seems like a sacrilege. But it took the King of England and not an American to force him to, even at this point, somewhat retreat.
Well, and that's very true. What Trump said, and you're right, he has said this before, and at a minimum, it shows ignorance about the Allied participation in Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya and other places too. It shows that he didn't even know about their involvement. It shows that the people around him didn't tell him about that, who should have known, and maybe they don't either. That's number two. Number three, the idea that he feels that they weren't doing the bleeding and the dying is an affront to the Americans who were there and saw it, an affront to those countries who sent their young men and women out there to Afghanistan and to Iraq to help us. It was not Article 5 that sent them to Afghanistan and Iraq. Article 5 was invoked after 9/11 that provided for the AWACS aircraft to go over the United States. Time had gone by since that Article 5 when the United States asked the alliance to get involved in Afghanistan, particularly, and then Iraq. I will tell you that I was the head of the NATO office in 2002, 2003, as we were doing the Afghanistan operation, just the United States with a coalition. And Don Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense at the time, sent a note down that landed on my desk that said, "I don't want to see a NATO flag in Kabul." And then a week later, another note came down and it said, "Could you please tell our ambassador to see if NATO could get involved in running what became known as ISAF, International Security Assistance Force?"
What was the change? What was the reason for the change?
I think it was the NSC staff around George W. Bush and maybe even the president, I don't know, saying, "Why would we not want NATO involved so that we don't have to carry the full load ourselves?" Rumsfeld at the time, and of course he's passed away, so he can't respond to what I'm saying, but I think he felt that NATO would muck it up. I think he felt that if NATO got involved, they would take control of the day-to-day because they're the alliance, and it would leave the hands of him there, Rumsfeld and the Pentagon and the Washington community. It would leave Washington and end up in Brussels and be subjected to meetings and the North Atlantic Council voting and things that would have NATO making the bigger decisions, because Rumsfeld and frankly a lot of the country wanted us to go in there with a posse and get rid of those guys. So the idea that we would turn that over to NATO, that wasn't what Rumsfeld wanted. But the White House came around and said, well, no, let's share it with them. And that's what happened, was NATO began to run part of the mission there, dealing with the fallout from the Taliban being removed from Afghanistan, trying to build a more modern nation there. And the U.S. stayed in command of the Special Operations Forces. So that wasn't NATO, that was us. And that made Rumsfeld happy because that was the pointy end of the spear as far as he was concerned, not the nation building side. And that's what NATO pretty much took on. NATO was very much involved. NATO allies were very much involved. NATO allies bled as well as we did. And so the idea that so many years later we can sit there and mock them the way that was done was abhorrent. And I do wish there was more blowback from the United States. Maybe there was, and I just didn't hear it. But there was certainly blowback from Europe, because I heard that, and we deserved every bit of blowback that we got from the European allies.
But where is the national security community in the United States? And where are good conscience Republicans who did take us into that war? Where do you think these people are, and why do you think that they're willing to let war dead be traduced by this president?
Well, I think for the Republicans, they, like on so many things, because of Trump, and if you're a Republican in Congress and you're depending on reelection and you cross Trump publicly, particularly, then you run the risk of being primaried, as they say. You run the risk of having to fight another Republican for your seat the next time the elections roll around. So they tend to be quiet and they tend to say things behind closed doors, but they're not going to say something publicly. As far as the national security community, I think the national security community here in Washington, and that's really people who used to be in government, people who used to be in the military, people who are experts of one way or another, former Foreign Service officers who all know better. They were saying things online. I don't know how much was said in a big public way. I did. But that, I think, there wasn't the kind of blowback you would have seen from what happened in Minneapolis when 2 American citizens were killed by ICE. You got a lot of blowback there and continue to. And there were videos and all that type of thing. I think that can't be expected as a result of what Trump said about the allies. But there was certainly recognition within the national security community that it was wrong, and a lot of online people being upset. So, but it's all within the bubble, and I wish it had been more public.
Do you think it's done any damage to, say, next time the next Jim Townsend who's sitting in NATO has to activate Article 5 and call upon allies and non-NATO allies for help? Do you think it will change the thinking, or do you think allies will just price this in that it's Trump and will move past it?
It's a great question. And I think in years past, If the U.S. had come to the alliance saying, we've got a big problem here, there's a crisis here, we need to do something about it, Libya, for instance, or Afghanistan, or Iraq, or piracy off of Somalia, or whatever it might be, the Allies always gave us the benefit of the doubt. I mean, so many times in my old job, I would go to like the Danish embassy and say, we're getting ready to go into Libya. We could sure use Danish F-16s as part of the formation. Or the Balkans crisis when we were fighting Milosevic, going to allies saying it'd be great to get you involved. No one turned us down. I mean, every now and then there was a little variant. I mean, the Germans didn't want to be part of Libya. Not that they didn't vote against it, but they were not going to send anybody in there. Greece had trouble with the Balkans, and so they voted yes, NATO should get involved, but they weren't involved themselves because people have political issues and they have political perspectives, and the alliance recognizes that. So they'll go along with something, but they might take part. But the point here is that nations, if the U.S. came in, there was such confidence in us, such trust in us, that if we came in and said, we think we need to do something about it, not that they would immediately say, okay, we'll follow you into dangers. It was, everyone gave it very serious consideration and usually took action within a couple of days if the U.S. felt that this was something that needed to be done. What's changed now is I think the allies will sit there and listen to this and then go back to their capitals and ask their prime ministers and others, what do you want to do? The Americans, they want to do X, Y, and Z, and should we do this? And so that hurts the alliance in terms of the leader of the alliance being second guessed or even third guessed because they don't know if they could trust the view of what the administration is saying because they don't trust the president. And that's never happened before. And so that's certainly something that reduces the alliance's capabilities to respond to problems.
One of the observations I picked up being here in DC this week was somebody who said to me, the thing the Americans always had was that everyone thought they were the good guys. That's why we would follow you into wars and do things. Now I think they've lost that. And next time they come asking, maybe we don't think they're the good guys anymore. And I know that's an incredibly simplistic way to think about it, but I did feel that resonated very well. And I think that adds to what you're saying about a bit of benefit of the doubt not being there next time.
Well, that's exactly right. We were seen as the good guys. One thing about NATO is that, and we see this in history, when the U.S. is not involved in Europe, and you think about the 1930s, the 1920s, the teens leading up to World War I, Europe doesn't hold together very well. And you look at the European Union, I mean, it's a miracle they're still thumping along. They are, but it's hard because so many nations have a different view of what they want, what their national requirements are, personality conflicts, ancient histories, ancient enemies struggling with each other across the table. With the United States, when we entered into the European security structure after World War II, when 1949 NATO was established, the U.S. became the Supreme Allied Commander. Europe was Dwight Eisenhower, for gosh sakes. The U.S. then jumped feet first into the European security structure for the first time in our history. We had always been neutral beforehand. A lot of people don't realize that, but World War II, World War I, most of those wars we were neutral. And so here we were, peacetime, we were going to play a role, and we sit around that big table at NATO, and the nations look to us. When there's an issue, they look to us to help settle it. We become the good guys in a sense that the little nations trust us, the big nations trust us. Greece and Turkey trust us. They might not like each other, but they trust us. So a lot of times we find ourselves refereeing those two countries. And so we are the good guys for the first time in Europe, helping Europe to not be at each other's throats all the time, but instead helping Europe to more or less work with one another together in the alliance in such a way that as nations build their military capabilities and they have their own national agendas and strategies and stuff, they're never against one another the way they would have been in the 30s. They can't be because they're all in the alliance. Our books are all open to one another in terms of our military capabilities and what we're buying and how we are all working together. So it's almost impossible for enemies traditionally to attack one another because we're all hooked together in this alliance. And so, frankly, that's one of the reasons NATO was founded, was to put a box for Germany. In the 20th century, Germany twice, as we know, caused these tremendous wars there. And after 1949, putting Germany in a box, making them part of the alliance, is what kept them from being a threat to their neighbors. And it kept peace in Europe. So that's the thing. And so for the U.S. no longer to be seen as the good guy, but maybe a closet bad guy or someone that might have a hidden agenda that, and traditionally we've never really had because we were the good guys, it really impacts European security. And you can see this if there's going to be a split in Europe between the Northern Allies who are going to come together to rearm themselves and to be there to deter the Russians, and then the Southern Allies who feel they're not going to do that because they're going to make a separate deal with Russia. They're in a different place than the Northern Europeans. And so right there, you introduce a split within the alliance. Whereas if the U.S. was more engaged, we would be bringing the alliance together towards a common objective and bringing everybody along. But right now, if there's not trust in the U.S., and instead you're getting coalitions forming together as a plan B, you're returning Europe back to the way it was.
Do you see that happening?
Yes.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So do you look at the coalition of the willing, for example, and see that some are more dedicated to shoring up Ukraine's security than others?
Some are more willing to be more forward-leaning to do that. So UK and France have said they're willing, if everything works out, and that's a big question, but they're willing to put forces on the ground in Ukraine as part of the security guarantee. Other allies haven't said that. Germany hasn't said that. So they're more willing to put flesh in the game, if you will, by putting forces in. The others are willing to put money in. They're willing to provide assistance to Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that coalition is doing that. But that coalition has proven itself to be a pretty effective coalition for negotiating with one another and agreeing to something like this. And so those members of the coalition are starting to say, we should probably stay together. I mean, after Ukraine is taken care of, we probably still need to keep the personal relationships going, the negotiations going, maybe exercise together so that we can be a plan B for NATO. If NATO can't do something, maybe we, the coalition, can do something if something needs to be done to face off against the Russians.
So that coalition of the willing, it really interests me, this architecture, because it also involves Australia and New Zealand. Again, some of these very reliable NATO partners that keep showing up. And I agree with you. I think it is a potential new framework or a structure for dealing with European security, but also potentially other security threats that aren't necessarily European facing.
Right.
And that brings me to China. Is what Trump doing on Europe in any way justifying the tilt or the need to focus almost solely on China and their own hemisphere?
Well, that's a really good question, because if you read the National Defense Strategy that just came out from the Pentagon, they're not defining China as being the threat that was stated by Biden and
not
Trump
even a
won.
Competition or competitor anymore.
No, it's like we're our friends and we're going to compete with one another, but we're going to give each other a break when it comes to. So it begs the question, okay, then why don't we now turn all that attention to Europe and dealing with Russia, which seems to be pretty aggressive. And if you read the National Defense Strategy, it doesn't paint Russia as this big aggressor. In fact, I can't even remember if it even mentions Russia in any way or shape.
It does. It says Europe can take control of
That's
Russia,
right.
and that Russia is basically so small and has worn itself out from its war in Ukraine that Germany alone could dwarf it.
That's right. That's right. I see you've been keeping up with your bedtime reading.
I stay up till 3 a.m. reading some of these documents that Elbridge and Co. like to release at odd times on a Friday night, Jim.
Well, wait till they make it into a movie. It's easier to
No, it's a picture book. There's five
or it's a comic
pages
book,
of
I think.
pictures. Yes. It's very heavy on the pictures
Yeah.
and references to Trump. So this is very interesting. Do you think that there is a genuine recalibration going on within the United States about how it wants to view China now? And do you think that that's something completely solely related to Trump being in power or MAGA, and that will be a blip? Or do you think this is the start of a reorientation towards the US approach on China?
I don't know. And I guess also you phrased the question in terms of the United States. It's interesting in terms of the United States as a people. How do we think about China? The person on the street, do they look on China as a big threat? Because it's been painted that way for years now, including by Trump. China, 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 his first term. How do the American people look on China? The stuff we buy is all from China still. There's a lot of trade still going on with this country that supposedly was threatening to us. And we were racing to deal with shortfalls in the Indo-Pacific. We had AUKUS with Australia. We have all these things going on. How can we turn so quickly to the Western Hemisphere if we've got this China issue, and much less Russia, but just China? And I think it's really unclear what the administration itself feels. We know Bridge Colby, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the Pentagon, who is the person in charge of what the policies should be within the Pentagon. We know he's a China hawk. And they must have tied him down for when they were writing this national defense strategy, because I just can't believe he would be so easygoing on China. But he went along to keep his job. And so you have the beginnings of a blueprint for spheres of influence there. Asia and China and the United States in the Western Hemisphere, and then Russia in Europe. And that seems to be fine with Trump. And it seems, as you read both the national security strategy and the national defense strategy, you kind of see the outlines of this. And I would say in the national security community here in Washington, those outside of government, we are just not necessarily bewildered. I mean, we recognize this from history. The Monroe Doctrine from the 19th century, spheres of influence from the 19th century. This is not something that we haven't seen before in our history books, but to actually see it alive and kicking here as an administration policy is something that is pretty unusual. So I think a lot of us are sitting here going, so where does this then take us? Are we still worried about China militarily? Because we're dumping a lot of money into building up the Navy to handle China. So do we still spend that money, or does it go in another direction? And then we haven't even talked about the Western Hemisphere. So what does this mean in terms of policy towards the Western Hemisphere? Are we going to do lots of Venezuelas? I think this is so new in a lot of ways that everyone's still trying to figure it out. How much of this is rhetoric? How much of this is ideology, if you will? And how much of it is not really practical? I think we're all a bit bewildered and waiting for events to begin to dictate what this all means.
One of the things, and I've read both those documents very closely, one of the things that strikes me, and it's been clear from the start of this second administration, is that MAGA feels aggrieved at the responsibility they've taken on, and they don't want to be the world cop anymore. Okay, fine. But what about the next administration and administrations after? Is the damage that they do in torching US leadership today, tomorrow, the next 3 years, is it fixable in a material security sense? Will someone be able to come back in, look at the smouldering ruins and build it back up quickly and with an ability that puts allies back on the same footing that we were pre-Trump?
The answer is no, in the sense that the house that is built from the ashes, if you will, is going to look different than the house that burned down. In some ways, and you hinted at this earlier, in some ways that's not a bad thing because there were problems with that house, one that burned down. It was too dependent on the United States. It wasn't enough burden sharing going on. There were other things that will not be missed as one builds from the ashes a new house. I think there's a willingness to build a new house. I think there's going to be, though, a blueprint for that new house that is going to be influenced by allies who are saying, look, I don't want to build it looking like that, U.S. It needs to have this and this because our relationship cannot be what it was before. We hope to rebuild the trust over time, maybe, but until then, we're going to insist on A, B, C, and D in terms of what this new structure, i.e. what the new relationship is going to look like. It will not be what it was. It's going to be new in some good ways, but in some other ways, in terms of trust and confidence in one another, it will be built in a way that second guesses each other, or built in a way that doesn't necessarily trust each other. Instead, it lives by trust but verify instead of trust. And we'll have to live with that and see what happens over time in terms of a post-Trump relationship. It will not be the same. It might be more mature. It might be more level. It might be more capable. So it could build back better, as an American president once said. But we'll have to wait and see.
And does that make China an eventual winner?
No, I think, it's an interesting question. If this rebuilding of the relationship, the better, between the US and Europe, if that happens and it brings about stability and confidence and calm in Europe, and we'll just put Russia aside for now, China doesn't mind that because it wants to do business in Europe. And doing business in Europe is helped along if Europe is confident in itself and Europe is prosperous and has a good relationship with the US. It's easier for China to go in there and do business than if we're all at knife points and vying from one another. I don't think a weak Europe or a Europe under the sway of Russia is necessarily good for China, because that takes a part of the world away from them that is a very rich part of the world that they would like to do business in. And if suddenly that's Russia's sphere of influence, or if suddenly the Europeans are not as confident and are afraid of the Chinese or whatever it might be, that's not good. You could also say that if the world is chaotic in the next 50 years, that confident world of the post-Cold War days is no longer around, and instead it's chaotic. There's not a lot of trust. NATO is still there, the EU is still there, the US is still there, but there's divisions. Then that could also be a place for China to play one against the other, too. And so in terms of geopolitics and in terms of power politics, chaos and disorder is something that China could take advantage of. But as I think about that as options, I think China probably would rather have things calm and for them to remain strong and have access to where they need to have access, and not to have chaos and playing one off against the other, thereby denying themselves some markets because it's part of the game that they're playing, this geopolitical playing one off against the other. If things are cool and calm, I think there's more money to be made.
You worked in Greenland.
Yes.
So is Trump right about Russia and China wanting to dominate that? And do we need the US to acquire Greenland in whatever way that might come about for that to be kept safe?
Well, first, I was in Greenland in 1990, 91, 92 because I was the very young Scandinavia desk officer in the Pentagon. The Cold War had ended, and the Air Force said, we don't need the 2 bases and the 3 radars that are on Greenland. So could we please talk to Denmark and Greenland about dismantling those, closing a base? Let's keep one open, close one base.
Jim, do you feel like your life is living a weird loop?
Yes, I wake up in the middle of the night and go, how did this happen? So I had to organize an interagency group. We negotiated with Greenland and we negotiated with Denmark because you just don't go and close a base. You've got to have environmental cleanup, and there's excess equipment there that we don't want, but maybe Greenland does. They owe us money because if we leave a facility behind, you might not believe it, but if the law says if we leave a U.S.-built facility behind in Greenland, Greenland has to pay for it. And they're going, what? And so it's a very complicated thing. And so we had to negotiate with them, and we finally reached agreement on who owes what and what the cleanup looks like and what does U.S. Air Force pledge to do and what does Denmark do and what does Greenland do. We all agreed, and we signed agreements, and then we closed these facilities. I tell this story because there still is this talk going around in circles saying we had 20 bases on there and we had all this stuff and thousands of soldiers. That was during World War II. And maybe during a bit of the Cold War. But by the time the Cold War was over, we did not have all that stuff there. But we had a very close working relationship with Greenland, and then Greenland Home Rule, which is their new government. Well, not new anymore, but Denmark began to give them sovereignty and home rule over time after the Cold War. And so you have Greenland and Denmark and the United States. And so we kept intact the 1951 agreement, and I think we updated it in 2003 or something like that, which really gives the U.S. a lot of free reign over the military aspects of that island, just as long as we negotiated and work it with Denmark and with Greenland. We just can't march in there, Trump notwithstanding, but under the agreement, yes, the Greenlandic people and the Danish people have already said, yes, if you feel you need to go, do it, just tell us.
So are you saying there was absolutely no need for Trump to do what he did in threatening to take it?
No, he fixated in his mind the idea that we needed to own it because he didn't trust Greenland Home Rule, and he didn't trust the Danes that they were strong enough to keep the Chinese out or the Russians out. The Russians aren't so interested in Greenland. It's really the Chinese. And the Chinese are interested because there are minerals there, but they're very hard to get to, by the way, and that's a whole nother story.
I
But
mean, if it was possible, people would have
oh,
invested now. It's so difficult to invest in
yeah.
Greenland. That's why there's no
There's like
infrastructure there.
50,000 Greenlanders. They'd all be millionaires by
Yes.
now. But what is important about Greenland that a lot of people don't know is that with climate change, the Arctic ice has been melting, and there is soon to be a usable commercial sea route above Russia called the Northern Sea Route. A lot of people don't know about this because it's not quite there yet. But the Chinese can put cargo on their ships, and instead of sailing around, going through the Suez Canal or going around Africa, whatever they might be doing to go to Europe, they can now go up over Russia and then down by Greenland and Norway into the North Atlantic and then to Antwerp, wherever they want to go. So that saves a lot of money and it saves a lot of time. And the Chinese are very interested in this. And it would be logistically helpful if they had a port or something in Greenland or facilities in Greenland that would help their ships and do that kind of thing. And so over the past few years, the Chinese have tried various ways to entice Greenland to give them preferences on this or that, and they've been pushed back. And same thing in Iceland, by the way. So the Chinese have not been able to make a lot of progress. For some reason, someone put in Trump's mind that this is a big problem and that there are Chinese and Russian ships all over the place around Greenland and they're doing all these things, which isn't true. That Northern Sea Route is still full of ice. It's not an open seaway yet. I'd say, 10 years from now or 15 years from now, assuming global climate change continues, and I hope it doesn't, but if it does, that will open up that to more of a route. But right now, there are not ships going around there. And so under this agreement, if the time warranted us doing more on Greenland, we could do it without a problem. What we will not get is sovereignty over the whole island. But if we wanted to build another base, we've got one there now, Thule, although it's got a Greenlandic name now, which I can never pronounce. But if you've got a second base that you need to build, those bases are sovereign for the United States. It's like an embassy here in the United States or in many countries. That embassy is sovereign territory of that country. And it's the same kind of thing for a base. A Greenlander can't just walk into Thule. And so, as you said, frankly, we already had what we needed. It's just that Trump and his people didn't trust Greenland Home Rule or Denmark or the security situation as it is today, didn't trust them to really be able to keep Chinese out, particularly if the Greenlanders voted for sovereignty for Greenland, which is the last step between Denmark and Greenland, is that they have a vote there in Greenland and the Greenlanders vote to be independent completely of Greenland. If they did that, the Trump people feel that they would be very susceptible, vulnerable to the Chinese waving money around saying, hey, we're your best friend. And so that's really, I think, what has concerned Trump. And they said, look, we're going to have to own this place because Greenland won't be able to protect themselves and we don't think Denmark's up to the job. That's what they said. Last point on that, though, is that it's not just Denmark. It's NATO. NATO is providing defense of Greenland. Denmark is part of NATO. So is Greenland. So if the Russians landed infantry on the north of Greenland, God help them.
There's your Article 5 moment.
Yes, absolutely. And so that got rhetorical, and then it got mixed up in U.S. politics, and then Trump got himself so far out on a limb talking about it that it took on a life of its own and became this huge crisis.
Do you think that was NATO's worst day?
Oh, boy. I'd say one of them, the top three. I'm not sure what the other two are, but this was a real crisis for NATO and for U.S.-Danish bilateral relations. And it took Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, sitting down with Trump and assuring him that NATO is part of this, and NATO will provide security for Greenland, and Denmark is a good ally, and whatever else he might have said, certainly that NATO is going to have an Arctic strategy, and NATO is going to make sure there are Arctic military capabilities among nations that might have to fight up there. So I'm sure he said enough so that he was able to give Trump some top cover for him to walk back in their press conference afterwards, where Trump was able to say, I got everything I needed, as if sovereignty was given to Trump. Well, that's not true. But I think Rutte was able to say a lot of things that sounded good to Trump's ear, and so he felt, okay, I can get myself out of this corner.
Jim, Mark Rutte is actually under a lot of pressure now in Europe because of the way he handled this. A lot of Europeans are angry at him and calling him an American agent. They wanted him to stand up to Trump. He's received quite a lot of criticism. Do you share in any of that?
No, I don't. I understand why the allies, European allies, feel that. They've all been bruised. I think they would have loved to have seen a tougher Mark Rutte at the press conference taking it to Trump. Rutte did explain things to Trump. He didn't call him daddy. I don't think he ever will again. And so I understand why there's a lot of pressure on Rutte, but particularly he had a press conference a few days ago from our broadcast here where he said to the allies, Rutte did, that you are dreaming, Europe, if you feel that Europe alone can face off against Russia without the United States. You're dreaming. We're not ready. We're weak. He was very blunt. And I think what he said was certainly correct. I don't know how things will be in 10 years. I think Europe will be very able, as we talked earlier about that. But I think that press conference really upset everyone. And I think Rutte had a Trumpian moment there by being blunt to the allies. And I think Rutte in the press conference earlier with Trump at Davos, I think he was still in his mindset of bringing Trump along and not alienating him. So I think that's hard to take and hard to hear now, that tactic of bringing Trump along. And particularly after the subsequent press conference where he was pretty tough with the allies, I think that's made him unpopular at a time when there's so much anger in the northern European capitals about Trump. I think Rutte not piling on upset them. But at the end of the day, he probably was doing the right thing.
Interesting. And do you think in NATO's interests, it's better to have a leader who's willing to be a little Trumpian, perhaps, with his own side?
Yes. I think part of the issues, and I saw this and I was part of it for years, we were a bit too soft on the Allies. But at the end of the day, and when I was there in the early 2000s, I have worked with them for a long time, the politics in European capitals and the threat perceptions in European capitals were not such that an ally could go to the people and say, we need to raise your taxes because of an unknown threat or because the Russians might come, or this is like 1999 or 2005 or 2010. It would be hard for a government in Europe to start a big rebuilding campaign and stay in office because the nations would say, Russia, what are you talking about? This is before the invasion of Ukraine. Even after 2014 and the invasion, the Russians didn't look so good in terms of how they were fighting Ukraine. And so a lot of the allied population was saying, why should we worry about Russia? They're hapless. And now, after 2022 and where we are today, certainly with the Russians, they don't look so hapless. They look much more scary. And 10 years from now, 5 years from now, they're going to really look scary. If we had hedged a bit after 1990, if we had the political oomph to do this, that would have been better to hedge for the potential that the Russians could come back or whoever. But we didn't. This is the Allies. Cut. Really until 2014, the invasion of Crimea, the NATO summit that was held in Wales is where the Allies said, okay, we got to do something. And they had the 2% earmark, et cetera.
Which they still didn't reach, really.
Well, they reached it a year or two ago. Not all of them. You're right. Spain's not, Canada maybe, and the UK is barely hanging in there. But you're right. And now they got to go to 3.5 in terms of procurement, the percentage of GDP, and then 1.5 for infrastructure, which might be easier to reach because if it's building a bridge, that's a good thing. It can handle a tank, yay. Means that gets to count towards the 1.5, but it's also a bridge for the taxpayer. So yay, we got a new bridge. And so that's easier to do politically than the 3.5. And so we'll see where nations are. But again, the closer you live to Russia, the more quickly you're going to get to that 3.5.
And finally, what is your advice to allies? If you were in NATO dealing with this, what would you be saying to European capitals about the best way to behave and act right now?
I think the top priority for right now is rebuilding their conventional military capability. That's the critical thing they've got to do. And that means more than just spending more money, which is part of it. But they've got to organize themselves, and they're working on it. This isn't something new, but they're working now on how does one organize these various nations into figuring out who's going to buy what. and how we're going to organize ourselves within NATO or outside of NATO, but I hope it's within NATO, organize ourselves so that we can exercise and train and we can be a formidable force. That's the first thing, is they've got to be able to do that. They've got to be able to fill the gaps that the U.S. might leave. They've got to be able to handle Russia by themselves if something in the U.S. happens so that we're not there for one reason or another. They've got to be able to do that. It could be we're not there because we're in this Asia Pacific fighting the Chinese. That can happen. So really, they've got to really double down on that. That's got to be the top priority before anything else. That's got to be what they do, number one. Number two is they've got to keep NATO intact, because there's a lot of things that NATO does that not a lot of people see, but it's how NATO goes about organizing the nations into a fighting force. I mentioned the word defense planning, and that's what I did. That's what the nations gather to figure out what each nation is going to bring to the game, what they need to buy, what their job is going to be. Here's the plan. This is where you're going to be. And so NATO as an institution and as a structure is what the Europeans need to organize themselves. They can't go to the EU because the EU just isn't, that's not where they are. Culturally, they've got some structure, but it's not the kind that will be really effective. The EU can be helpful in terms of funding, but not for organizing what needs to be done. They've got to do that within NATO. So if they lose NATO, it's going to be just a scrum out there among these nations, and that's not good. So that's number two. They got to keep NATO together. Number three, they do need to keep the U.S. alongside, because the U.S. right now is got things that the Europeans don't have yet. And so by pissing off Trump or whatever, then you're not going to have the U.S. necessarily alongside as much as you'd want. And you're going to have more on your plate to deal with without the tools to do it with. So they got to keep the U.S. along. So that's number three. Number four is Ukraine. They got to keep Ukraine in the fight. I don't know what's going to happen in terms of U.S. assistance to Ukraine. I don't see a peace agreement anytime soon. Putin doesn't want one. So as long as he doesn't want one, there's not going to be one. And so we got to keep Ukraine in the fight.
But Jim, I remember President Trump saying he'd settle this war in 24 hours.
Yes, he did. And he has said a lot of things. And I think we've all learned to take it with a grain of salt, as we say. And so for Europe, this is something that if Ukraine falters and they're out of the fight, however that might happen, it frees Russia to have a very big military, to have a combat-tested military, to have very advanced combat capabilities that they didn't have at the beginning.
But haven't they worn themselves down with this Ukraine war?
Not yet. It's hard to wear down Russia. There's people, all kinds of people talk about, their economies and this and that. That might be us. If we'd be worn down and our economy would be a mess and the democracy would fail, that's not what happens in Russia. We're going to keep going. And Putin is dedicated to that. And their economy is on a wartime footing. So this is something that we shouldn't bank on as getting us out of the trouble, is this happening. So Europe has got to keep Ukraine in the fight, giving them what they need, including the frozen assets. They're crazy not to pull that into this. If Ukraine goes, then the Allies are going to be under pressure. Does this mean that Russia's going to attack Estonia or Poland, or are they going to send missiles into Paris? That doesn't necessarily mean that. But it does mean that they're going to be able to blackmail and bully and do other things and have Europe under their boot. That's not good either. And to get the boot of the Russians off your neck means going to war with Russia. Is that what Europe wants to do? Given the nuclear capability that Russia has and Putin's willingness to shake that nuclear saber? No. So you've got to deter him. And so Ukraine is buying Europe time to get stronger to deter the Russians. And that's what they've got to focus on doing. Once your deterrence fails, you're in trouble.
Well, that's a cheery note.
I know. I wish I could come up with something cheerier, but maybe we were too cheery in the past and we have to be uncheery now. I don't.
It is the world we face. I agree.
Yeah.
Jim Townsend, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
You're welcome. Thanks for the opportunity.
You've been listening to Latika Takes with me, Latika Burke. You can find my work at latikambirk.com and this podcast where you find all your podcasts. See you next time.